Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's a few minutes after 7. It looks like we have a number of people who've been able to join us tonight. Before we begin, we'd like to announce that tonight's meeting will include Spanish and Chinese Mandarin language simultaneous interpretation provided by interpreters on the Spanish and Chinese Zoom channels from now until the end of the meeting. You can join the Spanish or Chinese channel by clicking on the interpretation icon in the Zoom toolbar, which looks like a globe. As a reminder, we ask that everyone participating tonight speak slowly to allow our interpreter to translate your comments. And I'll let our interpreters do that right now.
Antes de comenzar, queremos anunciar que la reunión esta noche incluirá la interpretación simultánea al español y al chino mandarín por medio de intérpretes en los canales de español y el de chino mandarín, a partir de ahora hasta la conclusión de la reunión. Puede unirse al canal de español por hacer clic en el icono de interpretación en la barra de herramientas de Zoom, parece un globo terráqueo. Pedimos que todos los participantes hablen despacio para permitir que el intérprete exprese los comentarios de una forma eficaz.
Michael, go ahead with the Mandarin.
OK， 开始之前，我们先要声明一下，今天晚上的会议，我们有西班牙文跟中文国语的同声传译，根据这个西班牙文或者中文国语的Zoom频道来为你们提供，从现在开始直至会议的结束。你可以参加这个西班牙或者中文的频道，通过按钮，这个在 Zoom 工具箱的其中有一个图标，你按下那个按钮就可以参加西班牙文、中文的同声传译。这个图标就好像一个地球一样的。然后提醒一下，我们希望每一个人参加今天交流的时候，声音放慢，然后把声音清晰，然后再让同步翻译替你翻译你的意见。
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to the City of Albany's community conversation.
晚上好，欢迎到。
Good evening and welcome to the City of Albany's community conversation about housing. I'm Jeff Bond, Albany Community Development Director. I'm joined by my colleague, Barry Miller, the city's housing element consultant. Tonight, we're here to talk about housing issues in our city. Every city and county in the Bay Area is required by state law to prepare a housing plan by January 2023. Tonight, you'll hear about why we're doing this plan and what issues it will cover. This is also a chance to share your thoughts about Albany's housing needs and priorities. There'll be additional community conversations like this one throughout the winter and spring months. For those who are here, we'd like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded. We'll be posting the video on the city's website so that those who weren't able to join us today can also learn about this project. We're going to start off with a presentation and some background information on the housing element. There'll be an opportunity for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and your ideas. Next, I'd like to introduce our consultant, Barry Miller. Barry, we're not hearing you.
Yes, no, I was unmuted and I am now starting my video so you can see me. Great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Jeff. Appropriate that this slide says technology happens. Please be flexible and patient. We ask for your patience as we navigate this new webinar format for our community conversation on housing. Tonight, we're going to go over some ground rules before we begin the presentation. If you look on your screen, you'll see a button labeled Q&A, question and answer. You can type questions and comments in this window. We will do our best to respond to those questions after the presentation. When we get to the end of the presentation, we're going to ask that you use the raise hand command to let us know when you'd like to speak, either to ask a question or to share your feedback. If you do raise your hand, we will ask that you speak for a number of minutes, and then do be brief, as we'd like to give everyone who wants to speak a chance to be heard. We're asking that you respect each other's opinions, even if you don't agree with them. It's perfectly fine to disagree, but please do be respectful. And as I mentioned, do bear with us if we have technology glitches. It's our first webinar using interpretation, and we're excited about that, but also recognize that there may be some technology issues as we navigate through. We're going to actually get started with a couple of polling questions, and many of you, I think, are familiar with Zoom and know that we have this polling feature built in. We'd like you to respond to the question, where do you live? And let us know if you're a homeowner in Albany, a renter in Albany, if you live somewhere else, or if none of the above applies. And I see responses are coming in. If everyone can please indicate their response to this question, we'll give this about 15 more seconds and ask everyone to just take a moment and do this. And then we'll report out on the results. Let's give it 5 more seconds. So why don't we show the results? Looks like most of you are homeowners in Albany, about 85%, and then a number of you are renters in Albany. One person has indicated none of the above, and thank you for responding to that question. We're going to now move on to the next polling question. If I can advance my screen. And this question is, where do you work? For those who are employed, we're asking if your regular place of work is in Albany, if you work outside of Albany, if you are not currently working, or if the answer to this is other. And it looks like there are about 20 of you that are replying to this question, and roughly half of you work outside of Albany. A couple of you work within Albany, and a little more than a third of you are not working or retired. Thanks for participating. We have 2 more of these polling questions, and then we'll move ahead with the presentation. So let's move on to the next polling question, which is, how long have you lived in Albany? And you can see the choices here. Okay, let's give it a couple more seconds. We've got 22 responses to this one. So more than half of you have lived in Albany for more than 20 years. So we've got a lot of longtime residents here, which is great. We also have a couple of folks who have lived here less than a year and less than 5 years. One person who doesn't live in Albany, but we do have a large number of longtime residents. I see 27% that have lived here for 11 to 20 years. So thank you for joining us again. A lot of longtime residents. And let's go to the next and final of our polling questions here. Oops, sorry about that. I jumped ahead. And we're asking for your age on this one. And I know that the polling results are there, but I'm not seeing them on my screen. Jeff, can you see the polling results for this question? I would love it if maybe we can share them. There they are. Okay, Never mind, thanks. So we can see the polling results here. And we have about half of you that are in the 50 to 64 age group, roughly a third that are 65 or over. And then the remainder, about 20% of you are under 50. So this is helpful. I think it tells us that we need to do additional outreach toward our younger adults in the community. There are a number of things we have planned to try and reach out to younger Albany residents as part of this process, but we're glad that you're all here regardless, and thank you again for coming. So we're going to move ahead with the next part of the presentation, which talks a little bit more about why we're here today. So this is the crux of the situation in a nutshell right here. During the last 10 years, housing growth in the Bay Area has not kept up with job growth. Since 2010, the 9 Bay Area counties added 1.3 million jobs, but we only produced 140,000 units of housing, or roughly 1 home for every 9 jobs that were created. The blue bars on this chart show the number of jobs that were created in each Bay Area county between 2010 and 2019. The orange bars show the number of housing units that were added in each county in the Bay Area. And you can see the ratio above those bars for each of those counties. In Alameda County, we added 250,000 jobs during that decade. We built 30,000 housing units, or roughly 1 unit for every 8 jobs that were created. By growing our economy without adding housing, what we've seen are longer commutes, more overcrowding and doubling up, and significant increases in housing prices. And it's not just the growth of high-income jobs at Google, Facebook, and other tech companies and large employers in Silicon Valley and San Francisco. The growth of higher income jobs has also fueled growth in lower paying jobs, like those in education, retail, food services, landscaping, and construction. On this chart, the orange bars show the number of jobs created by income category in the Bay Area, with low income jobs on the left, moderate income jobs in the middle, and upper income jobs on the right. The blue bars show the number of housing units we've added that serve each of those income categories. You can see that we're doing a better job building housing for those in the upper income categories than we are in the low and moderate income categories. In fact, very little of the housing that we've built in the last decade is affordable to our lower wage workers, and this has created a growing gap in the housing market. When you have an imbalance between supply and demand, as we've seen here in our region, one of the consequences is an increase in prices, which you can see plainly on this slide, which shows the median home value in Albany over the last decade based on data from Zillow. We've seen an increase of 140% just since 2012, with the median home price in Albany increasing from $533,000 9 years ago to over $1.2 million today. While our rents haven't gone up quite as steeply as home prices, we've also seen them increasing at a faster rate than income. One of the consequences is that our service workers are having a harder time living in our community. This table shows the average wage in a few different occupations in Alameda County. What you see also is the percentage of your income that would be required to afford the median priced apartment in Albany if you're in that occupation. So if you're a preschool teacher living alone in a 1-bedroom unit, you may be spending 66% of your income on rent and utilities. If you're a firefighter, you may need to spend 39% of your income on rent and utilities. It's getting harder to make ends meet and have income left over for food, transportation, medical costs, and other expenses. There are some benefits to having a more diverse mix of housing choices in our community. We can create more opportunities for young families to find a first-time home, something that's out of reach for many families with children right now. Think about whether you could afford the home you live in today if the cost was $1.2 million when you bought it. We can provide places for our kids to live as young adults. Right now, we know many of our kids won't be able to live in Albany as adults because there are no housing options for them here. We can provide more options for seniors, making it easier to age in the community instead of moving somewhere else with less expensive housing. And we can help people who work in our community, like our teachers, our retail workers, our restaurant workers, and our firefighters. We can help them find housing locally instead of commuting for an hour each way. And that shorter commute translates into less traffic on our highways and reduced greenhouse gas emissions, which actually serve a double purpose of helping us achieve our climate goals for the future. Finally, we can create stronger communities that are more inclusive and provide a great place where everyone is welcome. So why isn't the housing we need getting built? When you look at the data, this is a question you might ask, and there's not one single answer to that question. We're facing a complicated set of challenges that can't be solved by any one city alone. Some of the factors are shown here. We have a limited amount of buildable land. Most available sites are small properties that have been skipped over by development or already developed sites that need to be repurposed. They're harder and more expensive to develop. We also have a fiscal structure that favors commercial and industrial development over housing. Our cities rely on sales taxes, hotel taxes, business taxes, and other revenue sources that come from commercial land. And the policies of many local governments favor jobs over housing due to the higher cost of providing services to residential areas. We have high land and construction costs, among the highest in the country. The cost of lumber has increased by 300% in the last year alone. The cost of labor is higher here than in other regions, and other building materials are more expensive than they used to be. And the price of land is expensive, especially where sites need to be cleaned up before they can be redeveloped. Our environmental review processes, we know that they're critically important, but they do add time and money to the cost of construction. And finally, many projects face community opposition, which can result in their being delayed or scaled down, making it less profitable to build. The state of California has gotten much more aggressive in recent years by adopting new laws and requirements to deal with these factors. They've been especially focused on removing obstacles related to community processes and requirements for new housing. The laws that you see on the screen here are actually only a fraction of the bills that have been signed by the governor in the last 4 years. The laws have completely changed the landscape for what local governments can do and can't do regarding housing in California. That's the reason why we're here this evening. So we're going to shift now to the next part of the presentation and tell you more about what the housing element is. Before we do that, we have 2 trivia questions for you. These are going to use the Zoom polling feature as well. But in these cases, there is one right answer for each of these questions, and we're going to see how many of you get that right. So the question is related to the new 2020 census, which just was released a couple of months ago. This is a 100% sample survey of everyone in Albany. And we're asking you, what do you think, how many residents did Albany add between 2010 and 2020? So 10-year period, how many residents did we add? I'll give you guys a minute to respond. Okay, let's go ahead and end the poll. I see 25 responses, and we'll share the results. So it looks like about 40% of you answered 1,250, but the actual answer is 1,730, so 24%. 6 of you got it right. and you get the gold star for knowing what our growth was during that time period. A couple of you thought Albany lost population. No, we actually grew by 1,730 residents. Now there's a flip side to this question. Let's go on to the next slide and we'll go with the next question. So we see we gained 1,730 residents. The next question is, how many housing units did Albany gain between 2010 and 2020? And we have a number of choices here. We'll see what you think. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and end the poll on this one and share the results? And looks like, can we share the results for the poll? Here we go. So those of you who answered 250 are correct. You seem to have gotten the message, the underlying message here, which is that we added a lot more people than homes. And I want to add that of those 250 housing units that were added, 175 of them were in the Belmont Village senior development on San Pablo Avenue. So when you take that out, there's really only 75 additional housing units that were added during that 10-year period. If you think about the math there, with 1,730 additional residents and only 250 more homes, there are a couple of things that tells us. One is we have lower vacancy rate now. And two is that the average size of an Albany household is larger. And the census tells us that the size of an average Albany household went from 2.49 people in 2010 to 2.62 people in 2020. So we're seeing our households getting a little bit more crowded, in part because of our housing situation. Let's stop the share at this point and move on. This was our last polling question. So without further interruption, we're going to keep moving through the slides. If I can get this to advance, here we go. So let's talk about the housing element now. In a nutshell, this is the city's guide for addressing the challenges that we just laid out in that last series of slides. Adopting a local housing element is not a new requirement. Cities have actually been required to do this as part of their general plans for more than 50 years. But the requirements have been become much more extensive in the last 2 decades. This is the only part of the city's long-range plan that has to be updated on a specific schedule set by the state, in this case, every 8 years. It's also subject to approval and certification by a state agency. When we complete the housing element, we have to submit it to the California Department of Housing and Community Development. HCD is the acronym for that, and they certify the housing element. It's the most prescriptive part of our general plan in that there are very detailed requirements from the state about what must be included, including both the data and the programs. Through every housing element, the city has to demonstrate that they're accommodating what's called their fair share of the region's housing needs. And we're going to talk about what that term fair share means in just a moment. Every housing element, no matter how large or small the community, has to include these mandatory parts that you see here on the screen. First, there's an assessment of housing needs, which considers factors like age, household size, language, employment and income, family structure, as well as the special needs of people with disabilities, extremely low income households, as well as seniors, farm workers, and single parents. Second, there's an evaluation of our prior housing element, looking at what kind of progress we've made on implementing the goals and objectives that we adopted 8 years ago, the last time we did this. Where the city has fallen short, the housing element looks at ways we can improve our performance or change our objectives. Third, there's an evaluation of constraints to housing production. This includes government constraints like our zoning rules and permit fees, and non-government constraints like our zoning rules, like our building material costs or the availability of water or interest rates and financing. Fourth, there's an evaluation of resources, and the focus here is on sites in the community where housing can be built. Finally, we're required to evaluate fair housing practices, including lending patterns, evictions, fair housing referrals, and so on, to ensure that our policies work toward having a more inclusive community. All of these analyses feed into that purple bar across the bottom of the screen, which is our action plan, and that includes goals, objectives, policies, and actions for the next 8 years. So how much housing are we planning for here in Albany? This is not something that we get to choose ourselves. In this case, the housing element responds to an assignment that comes from the state of California and the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG, and this is how it works. The state determines the number of housing units that need to be built in each region of California in order to meet expected housing needs over the next 8-year period. Then it's up to the regional councils of governments, which in our case is ABAG, to distribute those units to the individual cities and counties. And then it's up to the local governments to prepare plans showing how they're going to meet their assignments. So in 2019, the state determined that the 8-year need for the 9-county Bay Area was 441,176 housing units. And that's based on economic models and evaluations of what the current need is and what the projected growth and future need will be in the 9-county Bay Area. I want to point out that number is 2.5 times higher than what it was during the previous 8-year housing period. So we knew that when this number was released that we were going to be seeing a large increase in our own assignment. The units are distributed in this case by a 37-member advisory committee that was comprised of elected officials, planners, and housing advocates from each county in the region. And they met for over a year and looked at options for allocating that 441,000 unit total to the 101 cities and 9 counties in our region. They ultimately settled on a method that considered the number of residents in each community with weighting factors that shifted more units towards communities with jobs, public transportation, and high resources. And what we mean by high resources or high opportunities are good schools, higher incomes, good jobs, and other features that contribute to economic success. So this process of allocating the housing to each city and county is known as the RHNA. That's the acronym for the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as I mentioned, as a result of changes to the way this is done, many cities were left with much higher assignments than they had last time around. In Albany's case, our assignment for 2023 to 2031 is 1,114 units. It was 335 units in the last cycle, so this is an increase of 232%. This doesn't mean we need to go out tomorrow with hammers and shovels and start building 1,114 units. What it means is that we as a city need to demonstrate that we have the capacity for the private sector and the nonprofit sector to build these units, and that we've done what we can as a local government to remove obstacles to construction. Ultimately, it is up to the market to build housing, not something that the city actually does as a developer in our case. So it's not just Albany that saw a big jump in our assignment. You can see here the increase for a few other East Bay cities that have similar population sizes to Albany. You can see that Piedmont's allocation went up by 900% almost. I see 878% on the slide. Lafayette, Moraga, and Orinda all went up by over 400%. El Cerrito went up by a magnitude just about the same as we did, 250%. Virtually every small city in the Central Bay Area saw a big increase. Now, our assignment is more than just that big number, that 1,114 units. We can't just go out and build 1,114 single family homes and say we've met our target. 486 of those units need to be affordable to low and very low income households. You can see on this slide how those income categories are defined. So in each community, the assignment is broken down into these 4 categories. In Alameda County, a household earning between $68,500 and $109,600 a year, a household of 4, would be considered low income. That same household of 4 would be considered very low income if they earn below $68,500 a year. And the income ranges do vary depending on the number of people in the household. So the numbers are slightly lower for a family of 3 or a household of 2 or 1 than they are for a family of 4. And they're higher for larger families. So when we talk about affordable housing or housing that's affordable to folks in these income categories, we're using federal standards established by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. And these standards say that your housing costs, which include your utilities, your taxes, insurance, and so forth, are no more than 30% of your gross income. So if you're that very low income family of 4 earning $68,500 a year, 30% of that income is $1,713 a month. If you're paying more than $1,713 a month for housing in that income category with that number of persons in your household, you're considered to be cost burdened and overpaying for your housing. And if we look at rental housing in Albany today, there are a few units that are affordable to lower income households, but there's very little, almost nothing affordable to a very low income household. On this slide, you see the asking rents for a few currently available apartments in the city. These are Craigslist ads from units in Albany in November. And you can see the income that would be required to meet that 30% threshold. Many apartments in Albany require an income of over $100,000. And there are a lot of Albany households that earn less than that, and they're paying well over 30% of their incomes on housing. And buying a home in Albany is completely out of the question for these households at these income points. And you can see on the slide that even the rental house down at the bottom of the slide, which rents for $4,250, would require an income of $178,000 to be considered affordable. So we mentioned earlier that the city needs to demonstrate that it has the capacity for 1,114 units of housing. And one of the major purposes of the housing element is to map out where those sites are located and how many units they can support. We have to provide detailed information to the state on every site that we identify. So what you see on the slide in the bulleted list is what gets counted. First, we count approved unbuilt projects. So for example, we'll count the approved units at the Albany Bowl development toward our RENA. Next, we can count any vacant site where housing is allowed. This includes vacant sites that are zoned for residential development and vacant lots in commercial areas if housing is allowed on those properties. There's a pretty limited supply of vacant lots in Albany that are zoned for either commercial or residential development. Next, we can also count underused commercial sites, and this is where it gets tricky. This is where our greatest potential is. Underused is a subject that's already developed. We need to make the case that it's a realistic place for housing. For example, by pointing to other sites on the corridor or elsewhere in Albany that have been developed elsewhere in, I should say, not just Albany, but El Cerrito, Berkeley, and other communities nearby that have developed similar sites in a similar way. The state of California has limited our ability to count certain sites. If they're too big, we can't count them. If they're too small, we can't count them. Or if a large number of public hearings and special permits are required for development and so on. And I should clarify, it's not that we can't count them, it's that we have to go through extra effort to demonstrate that they're realistic sites, and there are some specific requirements that apply. We can count institutional uses like churches and schools with extra land or underused property. And we can count accessory dwelling units or in-law apartments as long as we have realistic assumptions about how many are going to be built in the future. A new state law requires that we also, through the housing element, demonstrate that we are affirmatively furthering fair housing. And you can see the definition of what that means on this slide. It's not just enough to identify sites and adopt policies and then put the housing element on the back burner for the next 8 years. We have to proactively work to encourage housing construction, to reduce segregation in the community, and to promote fair housing practices in the way housing is sold and rented. There's a lot of data analysis that comes with this requirement, including maps of racial and economic segregation in the community and the region, and an evaluation of our housing sites to make sure that we're not concentrating all of our affordable housing opportunities in one single location. So a big part of the work to be done through this process is aimed at meeting these requirements and then developing policies and programs in response. So what happens if the city doesn't comply? Or what happens if we adopt a new housing element and the state says, nope, it's not good enough? One consequence is that we stand to lose state funds, not just for housing, but also for transportation. This could include the funds that we rely on for road repaving and maintenance, and other things that don't relate to housing. We also face increased risk of lawsuits and legal fees. This could include suits from housing advocacy groups, from developers or property owners, and even suits from the state of California itself. Cities face financial penalties and fines of up to $600,000 a month. And cities could even face the loss of their land use and permitting authority, along with mandatory approval of projects by the state. We also need to make sure that once we adopt the housing element, we demonstrate that we're taking it seriously. There is new legislation that allows the state to decertify an element after it's adopted. So it's not necessarily that the certification guarantees that you stay compliant for the next 8 years. You can lose that certification. We're coming to the end of the presentation now. Just a couple of slides on process. This is the timeline for the housing element update. We initiated this project last summer. We're now in fall 2021. We have completed the needs assessment and presented that to the Planning Commission. We're in the process of identifying our potential housing sites and looking at the constraints to housing development. In the next few months, we'll be looking at possible sites for rezoning and also developing policies and programs that respond to the data and that respond to the input that we receive at meetings like this one. We are working to have a draft housing element ready by the end of May 2022. That will then go to the Planning Commission and City Council only as a working draft and then be submitted to the state for their comments. So what I mean by only as a working draft is we will not be adopting the element in spring of 2022. We'll be just vetting it with the Planning Commission and City Council, submitting it to the state for their review, receiving their comments back about 90 days later, and then making revisions to the housing element in the fall to respond to the state concerns, then bringing it to the Planning Commission and City Council for adoption by January of 2023. We've laid out a number of ways that you can participate in the process over the next year. First, if you haven't done so already, please send an email to the address on the screen. That's the bottom left, planning@albanyca.org. We'll be posting materials on the project website, www.albanyca.org, and we encourage you to comment on draft documents. Please attend future meetings like these. As Jeff mentioned, we'll be holding more of these meetings in the spring, in the winter and spring, specifically related to the housing sites and also to proposed policies and programs. We also encourage you to attend Planning Commission study sessions and public hearings, which happen about every 2 months throughout the project. We encourage you, if you're part of a neighborhood group or a civic organization, invite us to your meeting. We'd love to come speak about the housing element and hear from you. We welcome invitations to come to the regular meeting of your organization. And if you want to tell us your housing story, we would love to hear it. And part of what we're hoping to do in the remainder of time for this meeting is hear your thoughts on housing in Albany. Your input can help us identify our housing needs, identify potential housing locations, and develop programs for meeting those needs. So that concludes our presentation. At this point, we're going to stop the screen share and look at the questions that you've submitted so far, and then give you a chance to speak. Let me just check in with Jeff and see if there are any. I do see some questions in the Q&A that I can respond to, and then we will ask you to use the raise hand feature if you're an attendee. We hope you have questions. We have 45 minutes to hear from you or feedback, your thoughts. I'm looking to see hands being raised. While we're waiting to see if there are folks who want to either type more questions in the chat, in the Q&A, or raise your hand to speak, I'm just going to read the questions and see if we can answer. So the first question, which is what is considered low to moderate income, that I think we responded to in the presentation. And it varies depending on the number of people in the household. Oops, looks like that one disappeared. Okay, I see it showed up as answered. Judy Kerr is hopeful that one day there'll be an urban land trust in Albany that protects single-family McGregor homes with ADU options and at the same time allows for affordable housing. That just disappeared as well. Let's see, nope, there it is. Sorry, there are questions that are coming in and my screen's jumping around a little bit. How would the current plan allow for this goal? Let's come back to that one or possibly talk about that one live. Brian has asked a question about zoning the city in a way we'd like to see it rebuilt if it were leveled in an earthquake or fire. Okay. I may ask some of you who have typed these questions in to kind of hop on the call with us if you would like, and you know, maybe we can have some conversation about some of the questions. Bonnie, I see you've asked another question about the locations that are proposed for development, and we can respond, and we respond to that one now, which is that we're looking at a number of sites. Many of the sites are on the San Pablo Avenue corridor. They front San Pablo Avenue. We're also looking at Solano Avenue. We're looking at the west side of Albany Hill. There are a couple of vacant sites or underused sites close to El Cerrito Plaza in the multifamily zoned area. There is a housing opportunity site within the UC Village property. So there are a number of places we're looking at. Bridget, yes, there will be an opportunity to read a statement. If you put the raise hand feature, we'll call on you. Jake Siegel asks the third rail question about redeveloping Golden Gate Fields. I'm not going to answer that one right now. That is not going to be something we're considering during this housing element. And maybe I should just ask Jeff to respond to that one.
Would you like me to do that now, Barry?
Why don't you do that? Yeah, and I'll. Sure.
Yeah, so Gold Gate Fields property is unique in that there is a voter approved initiative back from the 1990s, I believe it was, or maybe it was late 80s, that requires any change to the zoning to go to the voters of the city. So it's basically locked in as waterfront related commercial activity. So as a housing site, as it stands today, due to the voter approved initiative, it's just not feasible to make that a housing site at any time in the near future. One thing, Barry, you skipped over a comment, a question from Margie Marks that I can just respond to, is the who is the we that would come to meetings, and it would probably be either Barry or myself, or maybe we would go together depending on our schedules and the nature of the meeting and so forth. But if there are other people that you would like to have us bring with us, we'd certainly be happy to have that conversation with you.
Great. Yeah. I just kind of scrolled up, but Brian, you have some great ideas. We should definitely talk about some of these things. I wanted to touch on some of the other questions, and then we're going to go to the raised hands. Yes, Aaron, let me clarify that the RHNA numbers are a minimum, and we certainly can choose to allow more units if we want. In fact, we have to include more units than the RHNA because the state is requiring that we have a buffer. We cannot just say we've provided exactly 1,114 units of capacity and not a unit more, because some of those sites are not going to be available during that time period, or they're going to get developed with non-residential uses or market rate housing. And so we actually need to provide a buffer of a couple hundred units beyond the 1,114. And we can provide more if we choose to do that. That's really the community's call and something we'll be looking for input in. There is a question about parking. That's one of the things we're going to be looking at as part of this process is what do our parking standards call for? What are they like? How do they compare with what's required in other communities? Are they forward thinking and anticipating some of the changes in mobility we're expecting in the future, or other forms of transit? So we will be looking at that question. Dennis,
if I could just add to that, Barry, as an example of how the housing element is a policy tool for the city. 8 years ago, when we did the housing element, one of the policies in there was to look at bringing a measure to the ballot to allow change in parking requirements for new housing. So that policy went into the old housing element, and that eventually was the city council approved putting that on the ballot, and in fact the voters did approve a change to our municipal code. So we definitely can further explore parking policies as part of the housing element.
Great. And to Dennis's question about will the recent approval of housing at Albany Bowl meet these guidelines, we will be counting the housing at the Albany Bowl toward our RHNA, but only a limited number of units in that development are dedicated as affordable to low and very low income households. I believe most of the units will be counted as moderate because they're going to be offered at rents that will be considered affordable to moderate income households. Typically, market rate rental housing is considered affordable at the moderate income level. So we will be definitely counting those units, but not they don't help us a lot with our lower income allocation. And we'll come back to Brian's comment. I do want to maybe switch over, and if we can maybe hear from Ed Fields first, and then move on to our other folks who have raised hands. We can, why don't we do that now?
Good evening. This is Ed Fields. Hi, Barry. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Ed.
Couple of quick comments and questions. I know we don't live in isolation in the Bay Area, and we're supposed to meet our fair share, as they call it, of the region's housing needs. And you told us how many housing units have been added in Albany in the last 10 years, but I'd be curious how many jobs have been added or subtracted in Albany in the last 10 years, just as sort of a reference point. And then a couple of comments regarding AB 686. So most Zoom meetings that I attend show the number of attendees. But apparently, in the interest of transparency in government, the city has decided to no longer do that. But I do thank you, Barry. You told us there were, I think, 27 people responding to the last question that you had. So that's 27 out of about 18,000 we're up to now. I don't know, population of Albany. So AB 686 says you need to make a diligent effort to achieve public participation of all economic segments of the community in the development of the housing element. So Besides the email that I got, because I'm signed up for a whole bunch of different city meetings, what are we doing to increase participation? And then the other side of AB 686, of course, is to promote and affirmatively develop fair housing opportunities and promote housing throughout the community, which I would take it to be not just rezoning San Pablo Avenue. So, and I guess that sort of leads to the real question, which is, what can the city do to increase the number of units of affordable housing?
Mhm.
So thank you.
Thank you, Ed. So I'm going to, maybe I think both Jeff and I may want to respond to those questions. And as far as our outreach, this is a small piece of a bigger outreach program and strategy that includes planning commission meetings, council meetings and study sessions, additional meetings like this one that'll happen throughout next year. We've got about 14 months before this gets adopted. I would hope everybody on this call can act as a conduit to other organizations and people and spread the word that this is happening. We are developing a dedicated housing element webpage. It should be up before the end of this month with an opportunity for folks to weigh in. I think part of what we're hoping to do, this is really our first big public event. We've had a number of planning commission study sessions, but we're looking for help from all of you, I think, in spreading the word and getting the word out about this process and putting some additional material out there in the community that this is happening and that we're looking for input. The other part of this is translation into other languages, and we're also working on part of the affirmatively furthering fair housing is reaching folks who have not traditionally participated because of language barriers or income barriers. So to the extent we can engage Mandarin speakers, Chinese, other Chinese language speakers, and Spanish language speakers or other languages, we're trying to do that. Ed, you raised a good point about the San Pablo Avenue. It's about 60% of the housing opportunity sites right now in terms of the number of units. And we are looking at other parts of the city. We're looking at the Pierce Street area on the west side of Albany Hill, and parcels on Solano Avenue and church properties and a few others scattered around. I mean, it is that San Pablo Avenue is the major transit corridor, and I think does offer the most opportunity, but it is, and it's linear. So it's not like we're concentrating everything at a particular node on the corridor, but rather it's you know, from the north end to the south end. So it is kind of bisecting, but your point's well taken. And, you know, we're going to keep looking and seeking some input on other sites. The last point was about affordability. Yeah, it's really difficult to try and raise the inclusionary requirement that with the percentage of units that need to be affordable higher than it is now. There are a couple of communities that have actually gone in the opposite direction recently and dropped their number because they found that the percentage was making it more difficult to get anything built. So the state of California, I think, really needs to step up and provide some additional funding for affordable housing. They're asking a lot of the cities by setting these much higher targets, and they really need to, I think, provide some funding much higher than what we've seen before. And if there are any affordable housing folks or developers, nonprofit folks in the attendees area, which by the way has 30 people, so I'll let you all know that, please raise your hand and weigh in on that question. Why don't, Jeff, did you want to add anything? I see about 5 other hands raised and we want to move on to that.
If I could just add to Ed's question, I think, Ed, thank you. You're asking good questions with respect to the promoting housing throughout the community and identifying sites throughout the community. I completely understand that. The challenge we face is that the reviewers at HCD are going to be checking the viability of each of these sites that we pick. So we can't just pick whatever one we want. and say, we're going to put housing there. They're going to check to see if they feel like it meets the state statutes as a potentially feasible development within the next 8 years. And we'll see how that goes. It's some cities, we'll have a real challenge with that. And I think we're one of those because we're essentially a built out city.
Thank you, Ed. Let's hear from Brian.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I had, thanks for the city holding this. I had a few questions. My first one was that you mentioned that homes are so expensive and on small lots. And so, that there's some barriers to development there, that who would tear down a $1.2 million home to build something that's slightly more dense. But my point on the first question was, wouldn't it still make sense to upzone, to allow more dense developments, even on smaller lots that already have homes, so that families that are like going to raise a house to put an extra floor above or below would have the option of making that a multi-unit home property, and B, in case, heaven forbid, the city's wiped out in some calamity, that everything's in place to build back to the density that would satisfy these quotas and so forth.
Great, yeah. So we are looking at the existing zoning regulations. Part of this process is an analysis of what our zoning districts allow. I think it's a bit of a challenge to take existing single-family home neighborhoods and upzone them unless the existing densities in those neighborhoods is already above what the zoning allows. And in that case, we certainly would upzone to be more reflective of what's already there. And there are maybe areas of the city that have single-family zoning, but the predominant housing type is 2 and 3 units because of previous patterns that aren't reflected in the zoning. So we'll take a close look at those opportunities. There are also some new allowances under Sb9 for additional housing units in single family zones that would allow 2 unit buildings, in some cases splitting lots to create 2 duplexes and so on, that could provide for that additional potential and make it more economically feasible. Again, that's a state law that has to be interpreted at the local level.
Okay. And my next one real quick was, what would it take for the city to put into the housing element a plan for the city to turn City Hall Triangle into 8-story affordable housing, for example, managed by Saha, with city services on the first floor that are currently there?
I'll have Jeff respond to that one. He works there, so.
Yeah, it's it's a really interesting idea. And to be honest with you, Brian, when we started brainstorming ideas during the San Pablo specific plan process, we kicked that around. Is that maybe a longer term solution? City Hall is a very unique facility. So I think what would probably be more viable is to move City Hall, and this includes the police department, fire department, and emergency operations center, just move that someplace else. The types of facilities that we have there and the security needs and the size of the fire station facilities, the apparatus bays, and so forth are unique and wouldn't really be a great complement to a residential site, but could, if we had another place to move City Hall and all of our functions, could that be a housing development site? It certainly could. I think the biggest challenge with that idea is to find out where we could put our own civic operations, and we'd want to relocate them to a place where we wouldn't otherwise put housing, if you will. So it's an interesting question that we did brainstorm a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as far as the size of the fire department, I know there's people are putting entire, like on the first floor, like Whole Foods and all kinds of things in big developments. And so I think the shape and the size wouldn't be an issue, but maybe security would, I don't know. And then my last question I wanted to hear quickly was, we're told the bowling alley development is the biggest in Albany in the last 50 years. Yet of the 200 plus units, only a dozen or so, I forget the actual number, are affordable, which are enough to qualify it for state density perks. You said part of your quota, which is all the developer really wants. You said part of our quota is for affordable units. If new affordable units keep going at that bowling alley pace, how many total units would we need to build to meet our affordable quota?
We would need many more than 1,114. Yeah, because that's 15. It's 15%. So there are a number of projects that are 100% affordable, like the satellite, the Saha project, which I think that's 62 units of very low. So we would be looking for other opportunities to build 100% affordable housing projects to meet some of that number. A lot of the ADUs actually meet the criteria for, at least for the low income housing. They tend to rent at more affordable levels. So one way we could do that is to step up ADU production and try and encourage more folks to do junior accessory dwellings or smaller accessory dwellings. But again, ultimately, it's a money question, and how much money will be available during the 8-year period from other sources to leverage housing that reaches lower and very low income people, and extremely low income. I mean, there's a segment of very low that is considered extremely low, which is 30% or less, and that's a very hard population to provide housing for through this process. So we need to be looking at all income levels.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Hello,
Yeah,
buddy.
Howdy. Thanks, Barry, for a clear presentation. One
you.
question is again on the SB9 and Senate Bill 10. I know that I didn't know if there's a way, given the size of our town, to be able to forecast what that would mean in actual numbers for duplexes and fourplexes that would come out of those two laws. Because it could be a big number. Maybe the density is so small here that very few parcels would qualify for that 40% minimum on the split. But for places with larger plots, that's a pretty big deal in terms of increasing the numbers. That was one. Two was, do we have anything special in Albany which is trying to attract nonprofit developers? If we're trying to hit, because most of the developers who are coming to town are going to hit 15% and no more, right? That's just, they're going to try to turn their percent to the degree they can, make their numbers work. Whereas an affordable nonprofit is coming with a different mission, like Saha, right? So does Albany have something different than, say, Berkeley or El Cerrito, Oakland, that would be more of an attractant for affordable housing? And then the last one, number 3, is that I'm just curious if you were able to forecast, let's say if you kept current zoning, FAR heights, whatever the metrics were qualified, that you have currently now, and you tried to get the 1,200 units, would you actually have the so-called mass to do that? Or is it going to require some fairly serious upzoning, which I'm a fan of, to make those numbers work? Does that make sense? Saying if you had to build, if you had to hit those numbers, could you even do it with the current zoning you have? Or is it also going to force upzoning to try to get those heights? Or do you already have that in place, say with 8-story along San Pablo and Solano? Yep, those are the 3.
Yeah, those are great questions, and I'll take a shot. The first one was about the Sb9 forecast, or any prediction of how many units we would see. I think the Turner Center, which is in Berkeley, projected that there'd be 1.5% of all lots would be eligible. It's a pretty small number. In Albany, we are challenged with a lot of very small single-family lots, so dividing those lots even further, just physically what it would take to do that and get another housing unit that would be on there. I think we're probably more constrained than most other cities. If you go to a more suburban city, there are many more opportunities than Albany, which is one of the densest cities in the Bay Area. So I don't think, I mean, our forecast would be we probably are not going to count on SB9 lot splits to meet much of our arena target. It's really more of a part of the buffer. The other thing is that we don't know that those units would be affordable. Your question about attracting nonprofits is really good, and it's challenging. And Jeff, I don't know, you may want to weigh in on this one as well.
You know, we try to be as welcoming as possible. I try to stay connected into the nonprofit affordable housing world and many of the people who are leaders in that. But we kind of compete with other cities in many respects. And, you know, we're certainly competing for the same pots of funds. So for say the Saha project, you know, we're ultimately going to be able to see that project move forward later this year, we think, but they have to compete against other nonprofit housing developers. As we get opportunities and sites for potential development, we will certainly be trying to encourage partnerships, even if it's a private developer, maybe encourage a partnership to see more affordable housing as part of a project, or encourage an affordable housing developer to actually buy a property and develop it themselves. And some affordable housing developers can do that.
It kind of reminds me of, say, when Amazon shows up in Georgia with a new plant, they get certain tax credits that the state is willing to push toward them. Is there anything on a local level like that?
Well, they already are getting a lot of tax credits. You know, we're waiving our fees, which isn't, in the whole scheme of things, not a lot of money, but we're doing everything we can here at the city, and there are some property tax exemptions as well for the county and state. But it really does take an infusion of cash ultimately to build these projects, and it runs around a couple $100,000 or more per unit to actually build these projects realistically these days.
And Buddy, you asked the question about the zoning and how much housing could be built under the current zoning. We do need to change the zoning regulations in order to make the number that's been assigned to us. So there, concurrently with the housing element, there's a specific plan moving forward for San Pablo Avenue that is looking at increasing building heights and the allowable building envelopes that will help close that gap, but it won't close it entirely. So we will need to identify a number of additional housing sites in the city that can help us get to that 1,200 or so units. So that's part of the process that we're going through now, is identifying what those sites are and how the zoning may need to change in order to make those numbers. One of the things that that helps is to not constrain the number of units using density, but to use floor area ratio instead, which allows us to, doesn't limit the number of units we can have on a parcel. It just limits the amount of floor area we can have on a parcel. So then units can actually be a little bit smaller if that's something that the city wants to do. And again, ultimately, all of this is going to be something that is discussed by the Planning Commission and City Council. So a lot of what we're doing now is pulling the ideas together to bring to them. And if there's a lot of support for a particular site or a particular approach or strategy, you know, we're open to those ideas and suggestions now.
Yep. The last comment on that is that if someone who wants to develop a piece of property knows that they have a by right development, which would often be, in your case, would have to be upzoned to get to that by right, which makes it conducive enough for them to want to invest in Albany. That is a huge deal for them, as opposed to up for a zoning review and at the whims of whatever city's policies are in place at the time. Because that by right thing leads into SB 330 and 35, so which provides some security as they move forward that the money they're investing has a clear path to deployment. Whereas certain projects in the past, as we've all known, have not been by right, they've been discretionary. And that's really tough when people who want to invest are having to go through a discretionary process. So just as, I'm sure you hear that a lot, Jeff, but the ability to call for a by right project and then use Senate bills to help guide that through is a very big deal. That's it.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you. And looks like we have Aaron Priven joining us.
Thank you. I just wanted to, well, let me just say that we moved to Albany in 2009 so that we could enjoy the vibrant street life of Solano Avenue and the other, and San Pablo Avenue. And I think we haven't talked about the positive aspects of adding more housing, which is that we get more people to help supply patrons to our businesses and vibrancy to our street life. And I think that, you know, we need to be aware, we need to present that in a way that says, this is not a negative, this is a positive. This is adding to Albany and making it a better place for everyone by allowing people to share our community. So I think that's really important. And I'm really in favor of an all of the above strategy for housing locations. And I hope that we can move forward on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And I see one more hand raised, and that's Deborah. I'm going to encourage folks, because we still have about 12 minutes. Okay, I see Margie's got her hand raised. Yeah, if you'd like to speak, do use that raise hand feature, and we'll call on you, and then we'll go to Deborah now.
Hi, this is I'm asking out of ignorance. Why is it that developers only have to provide 15% of low-income housing? Why is that a state law? And how do we change that? Why can't we push developers to provide more low-cost housing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Deborah. It's not a state law. Actually, the state doesn't require that we mandate any development provide a certain number of affordable units. This is something that cities do because they're leveraging that market rate development to get affordable units, but that's an option that the city has taken. The problem as you go above 15%, and many cities have gone 20% or close to 25% in some areas. Berkeley just adopted a plan for Adeline Street that has, I think, 50% in some locations. It just becomes harder for the market to build those units. And, you know, developers will tell you that when you start getting above 15%, they can't make their projects work unless they get some additional funding. And we don't have, Albany as a city doesn't have a large trust fund of money to put into these projects. So it becomes a matter of where is the money going to come from to close that gap to get those higher affordability levels. And the state has made it, they've been very generous in letting developers build a lot more units, even with relatively small percentages of affordable housing. As of January 2020, they raised the amount of bonus you could get if you included affordable units. So we've lost a little bit of leverage there. Again, Jeff, do you want to add any response onto that?
No, I think you cover it. We do have, it's a locally adopted ordinance. It's been on the books in Albany, I think, since the early 2000s, that 15% of it, of housing. It's a complicated, it interfaces in a complicated way with state density bonus laws. So in some cases, we actually end up with less than 15%. And that's again, because there's some state laws that override our local regulations. And it's frustrating because on one hand, they're giving this big mandate.
Why? I mean, the state is mandating us to do this, this, and this, but then they're not giving us any help to do that.
Right.
Seems like we need, that's where what we need to do is to go after at the state level to make changes so that there's more pressure put to. Is that a dumb question?
That's not a dumb question. That is absolutely I think the core of the challenge that we're facing with this housing element, but we're not expecting that to get resolved by the time we have to send this in, unfortunately.
Understood, but it certainly should be a long-term goal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. And Margie?
Hi, thank you for doing this. This is Margie Marks. Number one, I would like to see the housing element document the history of redlining that went on in the city of Albany. When we talk about fair housing, I think we should talk about that. Two, I've come to the conclusion we can't, unfortunately, change the price of housing in our city. And so to help people of lower income levels move here, I think we need to supplement them. In the 2015 to 2023 housing element, it states, quote, create an affordable housing fund which becomes a repository for funds that may be used to help support affordable housing in the city. And under status, it states that, quote, the city is in the process of creating this fund. So that was in 2015. To my knowledge, we don't have the fund. Maybe you can let me know if we do. I also think we need to change the percentage and the number of units. And I know I'll probably get a lot of flack for this, but I believe we should put a parcel tax on the ballot. I would suggest $10 a month. It would be $120 a year with exceptions for low income residents. This could be the affordable housing fund. The money could go to stave off foreclosures, evictions, supplement rents, pay move-in costs, and at some point maybe help people with down payments. The cost of administering the fund could come with the tax. We pay for it by the tax. An organization like Echo Housing could administer it. There's 53% renters in Albany. There's very few Section 8 units. The housing element needs to include some measure that would cause landlords in Albany to accept Section 8 vouchers. I have other stuff, but I'll let it go at that. Thank you for doing the presentation.
Thank you, Margie.
Barry, there are a few more comments and questions in the Q&A, if I can touch on those for a moment, just to.
Sure.
Hello?
Oops, we have one more speaker, and then we'll. Why don't we do that after that?
Okay.
Hello, Sinya.
Hi, yes, Signe Matson here. About this 15% affordable, that's not really a guaranteed firm thing, because the developer can supposedly give money to the city for the city to develop the low income housing. So just because it's promised, what kind of oversight is there on these developments to ensure that there is actually that minimal 15% number of units? Thank you.
I can respond to that, Barry. Sydney, thank you for your question. And our municipal code does have a provision where that could happen, but it's never happened in Albany. All the projects that were required, that met the criteria for providing 15% units that have been built so far, have provided those, and there's only been a few. Theoretically, a project could come along and instead of building it as part of the project, they could give the city the equivalent value, if you will, of that's gained by not building that affordable housing, and we could use that money someplace else. And that might be, at some point in time, that might be something to consider, but we've never encountered that. So again, any project that's come through so far that met the requirements for our inclusionary housing, that requirement has been held to them.
Great. Thank you, Signe, for the comment. And Jeff, you were, I think, going to respond to a couple more questions. While you're getting ready to do that, I wanted to take note that we have a little less than 10 minutes left. I see 2 more hands raised. So let's maybe go through 1 or 2 questions and then hear from the 2 remaining folks with their hands up.
So there was a question or comment from Bonnie regarding the development off of Cleveland Avenue in Washington. And what she's referring to is what we sometimes call the Saha project. It's an affordable housing project. It's right by the Peggy Thompson's neighborhood park. That project is expected to begin construction at the end of the 2022. They do have several more funding applications that they're working their way through. They're optimistic that they're going to qualify for those funds and that the project will be moving forward. So we're working pretty actively with them right now to make sure that the permits will be in place, the building permits will be in place for them to get started at the end of 2022. Nick Pilch did note, and I'm seeing on my screen too, at least on my screen, I can see the number of participants, and that right now, including those of us on the city side, there's 33, I think, showing up. There was a question about renters at 50% of the population, and I think that's roughly correct. I don't remember what, off the top of my head, exactly what the numbers were that came out of the 2020 census, but in general, about half households in the city are renters and the other half are homeowners. Do you happen to remember the number in more detail than I do, Barry?
I think it's 52 or 53% right now, and it kind of fluctuates between the owner majority and renter majority. When UC Village rebuilt all of the apartments, it went back to being renter majority. So yeah, that's correct.
Do you want to go ahead with some of the hands raised, Barry?
Yeah, let's take Judy and Elaine and see if there's anyone else after that.
Thanks. This is Judy Kerr. I want to just reflect on the fact that I see on my screen there are 22 questions to be answered or been raised, and I can only actually see the first 5 questions, the second of which is my question. So I'm appreciative of the opportunity to talk with you, having had the second question. So my question is really about what the city's role could be in establishing a trust fund. It has been mentioned that the City of Albany doesn't have a trust fund, and there is no money available to support through city funding any kind of affordable housing developments. But it's my feeling and my estimation from talking with other people's that there is the possibility that there are people in Albany who own property who are not perhaps as greedy as the $1.2, $1.4 million sale price might indicate on their property. So if we were to in some way create an opportunity for the wealth that is in these properties to be generated into a trust fund for the city to then continue to develop affordable housing, wouldn't it be a good thing? And so my question really for Jeff and anybody else who can answer it is, how would that work? How has it worked in other cities or jurisdictions? And what would need to happen in order for us to move in a direction where we could protect the historical value of single-family housing, leverage that value of single-family housing, dedicate that value of single-family housing to the city for affordable housing? So I'm happy to hear your comments on that.
Well, thank you, Judy, and I appreciate your question. A lot of cities, or at least some cities, do something of this nature. I'm sorry, I personally haven't had an opportunity to get into the details of it. So I imagine the mechanics of setting up some sort of a land trust are pretty straightforward. And the challenge would be building up the trust fund. And the exciting part of it would be thinking about how to use what we can build up to support the opportunities for existing residents as well as for new housing development for people that need assistance in making it affordable. So I think that's the kind of thing that we might very well end up wanting to put in as a future housing program policy in the housing element. I don't think we're here to say that's not something we want to do at all. We haven't had a revenue source to do that recently, and to be fair, we haven't worked on it. So maybe that does need to be something we start to work on in the next 8 years.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I just wanted to add too, I think it's an exciting idea and something that, that we can take a look at. It's exactly the kind of idea that we're hoping to generate through this process. And the parcel tax idea that Margie had talked about earlier, we don't know what the level of support for something like that would be on a citywide basis. This anything that would require voter approval and so on would need to be vetted. But just in terms of ideas and things that we can put out there and explore and flesh out a little more over the next year as we put this together, that's a great, thank you for the idea. Thank you for that. And we have Elaine.
Hi, good evening. I actually worked for the census as an enumerator, and my understanding was that the numbers we were down 8.9% in Albany. Am I inaccurate? And also I wanted to mention that many of us who worked as enumerators felt that the count was incorrect at Albany Village because you had so many UC people, UC was closed. So we do feel that the numbers were low there. And the only reason I'm bringing that to your attention is because federal funds, of course, are involved. So there is apparently some way to make a correction if your numbers are incorrect and, attain those federal funds again. So I just wanted to make that as a public statement that maybe somebody could get working on that. Again, most of UC Village was missing in action during the time the census was taken. Okay, thank you guys very much.
I'd like to respond to that, Elaine, and you're right. We were worried about that. We did work with the University Village staff, and I don't know the details, but they did engage directly with the Census Bureau to make sure that there was an accurate number. So on the University Village side, I think everything that could be done was done by the university in particular. In terms of the overall number, I was worried about what the results would be in the census, and I kind of pleasantly surprised that it was in the range of sort of what I expected. Again, Barry, what was it, 1,700 increase?
Yeah, it was a 1,700 person increase. And the interesting thing is that there's the American Community Survey, which is done every year in between the decennial censuses, told us that we actually lost population. And then the actual numbers came out from the 2020 census, and lo and behold, they were 1,700 people higher than 2010. So it was the opposite. There was something goofy that happened with counting UC Village residents as living in group quarters versus independent housing units. And I think that is still something that, we're looking at getting corrected, because it shows the group quarters would be more of a dormitory or a nursing home or something where people live in a congregate setting and not in individual apartments. So there still are some anomalies in the data that we're working on getting fixed. But yeah, I'm glad. I was glad also to hear that the census seemed to get the total number correct. I don't see any more hands raised, and I'm seeing that it's 8:30. I wanted to also point out to Judy's point that the questions that have been asked, I know we didn't get a chance to respond to everyone, but we will print the questions and I'll prepare responses to those we didn't answer on this call, and we'll post that on our website so that we can make sure we didn't miss anybody. I also wanted to check in with our Spanish and Mandarin interpreters to see if there were any questions that needed to be asked in Spanish or Mandarin, or translated rather.
有没有西班牙文或中文的问题 ？No.
Okay.
I haven't seen any.
Okay.
¿Algún participante quiere hacer un comentario o pregunta en español?
Yeah. 请问你们有什么中文的专家人员愿意提出问题吗？
And yeah, if Michael and Charles, if you guys see anyone who would like to speak, please do let me know.
No, I haven't seen any. I haven't seen any.
Okay. And Charles?
Me neither. Mhm.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Great. Well, it's 8:34 and we're just a few minutes past our reported end time. So we're going to close the meeting at this point and thank you all for coming.
现在是8:34，那我们
Okay. Again, we're going to do a few more of these in the new year, and we encourage you to participate and tell your friends and their friends and your neighbors. We look forward to hearing more from everyone, and thank you again for coming this evening.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Good night.